Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Combs, and in this video, I want to talk about another element of fiction, and that's character. Roberts and Jacobs define a character as a verbal representation of a human being, and if something's verbal, that just means with words. So you're representing a human being with words, and we're going to think generally about human being because, as we will see in some of the stories we read, characters can be animals, characters can be inanimate objects. So while Roberts and Jacobs define a character as a verbal representation of a human being, we might say a verbal representation of a person, an animal, etc. So basically, characters are the people who inhabit the story being told and carry out the action. Authors strive to make their characters seem believable to the reader, so the reader will connect with those characters and care about what happens to them. The best characters are vivid and complex. They deal with problems and experience triumphs that draw forth the reader's emotions and reveal some truth about humanity. Authors create such characters by giving them strong motivation. Now, just as we talked about with plot, authors try to have a well-developed plot so that the action in the story seems logical and plausible. You also want to have characters in your story that are believable, that act the way your reader thinks those characters should. So, motivation. Motivation is a force that drives a character to think, feel, or behave in a certain way. Many factors can motivate characters' actions. For example, the desire to succeed, the need for revenge, the burden of guilt or shame, or the hope of redemption. Now, we talk about two types of motivation. Motivation can be intrinsic, and that's based on internal values of a character. So, an intrinsic motivation might be that a character feels she should always tell the truth no matter what the situation is. So that causes her to act in a certain way. An extrinsic motivation is based on something outside that forces the character to act. So they're going to foreclose on my house and I'll be kicked out and I'll have nowhere to live. So that will motivate me to try to get the money to pay the house payment in any way I can get, or any way possible, right? So because you want your characters, or because an author wants the characters to be believable and to act in ways that the reader will think fits the story, this motivation is something that authors usually spend a lot of time on. Now, again, if sometimes in contemporary writing especially, you will have an author experiment with not having strong motivation or having a character act differently than the audience expects. All right. But most of the time, and especially in traditional writings and stories, you will see strong motivation. Now, I was looking at some websites to research for this presentation, and I came across this response to a discussion board on one of the websites I was looking at. And I don't know who T. James is. He's just a reader, or she, perhaps. But this is the clip art picture that I've used to represent T. James. But I think that this post sums up how readers might feel if a character doesn't have strong motivation or acts in a way that the author has not developed that character to act. So this is T. James, just a reader, and we'll call him a he, and he expresses sometimes the frustration a reader has. Remember, we talked about the frustration that a reader has with plot when it's not well developed. Well, unless your characters are well developed as well, readers can have frustrations also. So T. James says, one of the things that drives me bonkers as a reader is watching a character morph into something and someone else for the single and always obvious reason that the author needs the plot to go a certain way, or a certain hole needs to be filled. Think about Game of Thrones and Daenerys, right? She hears the bells and goes crazy. That is totally not within her character, but the writers needed, I guess, a quick way to dispense with her so the narrative and the series could end. So, done with skill, then it adds new layers and nuances to the story. In fact, how and most importantly why they change becomes the story. So if you change a character throughout the story skillfully, then it feels like it's a natural part of the story. However, if it's not done with skill, if it's done badly, it leaves me, T. James, with the question, why am I reading this, right? So you always need to think about or think about, if you're an author, what is the motivation of your characters? And as readers, we will be very concerned with motivation as well. So we said that there were two general types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. And let's look at the character of Jay Gatsby from the novel and films The Great Gatsby. And let's look at the character of Belle from Beauty and the Beast, in particular Disney's Beauty and the Beast film, and look at what motivates each of these characters. So Gatsby says, I have always wanted to be rich, but my main motivation in acquiring my fortune is my love for Daisy Buchanan. My acquisition of millions of dollars, purchase of a gaudy mansion on West Egg, and lavish weekly parties are all merely means to win Daisy back. So intrinsically, Gatsby values wealth, right? He grew up without very much money, so wealth is something he values. So that's his intrinsic motivation. But extrinsically, he is extrinsically motivated by his desire to marry or to win Daisy back because she married someone else. So let's think about Belle. I have always longed to get away from the small town life and find something more. When my father was imprisoned by the beast, I had to do something because I care about my father very much. So I took his place as the beast's prisoner. So intrinsic motivation for Belle would be that she values family and the adventurous life, right? So she goes on this adventure because she wants an adventurous life. But an extrinsic motivation would be that Belle's father is lost, so she must look for him. She probably would, at least for a little while longer, stay in the small town and long for her adventurous life. However, her father is lost, so she must go and look for him, right? So that's the extrinsic motivation. And the beast imprisoned her father, so she must do something about it. So in this slide, I have two situations, and we're going to look at the first situation together, and then I'm going to let you look at the second situation. So for each of the simple situations below, identify the actions taken by the character, then suggest some possible motivations for the character's actions in each case. If there are extrinsic and intrinsic motivations, identify both of those. So let's look at the first situation. It says, last week, Sam Smith replaced the family's breakfast cereal called Sweet Bits with 10 grams of sugar per serving with one called Tri-Grains, less than 1 gram of sugar per serving. At the supermarket today, he refused to let his toddler put chocolate-covered donuts in the shopping cart. So what actions does Sam take? Well, here's some possible responses. So I think that the actions that Sam takes are he replaces the family cereal with healthier option and doesn't let his child buy chocolate donuts. So what motivation might Sam have? And this is not in this simple situation, this is not really we're going to have to this is not well what I'm trying to say is this is not really found here in this actual situation. So we're going to have to think a little bit. We're going to have to infer a little bit. But most of the time in stories, you can actually find the motivation in the story there. And you can cite passages from the story to back up the motivations for the actions that you see. So intrinsically, Sam might value personal health and he might want his kids to be healthy, right? So that might be an intrinsic motivation. But extrinsically, Sam might have been talking to his neighbor recently, and his neighbor might have said, "Well, my child was just diagnosed with diabetes." So Sam might be thinking, "Hey, well, I don't want this for my family, so let's start eating less sugar," right? So now that wasn't in the situation. We sort of had to infer that or make that up. That is a possible extrinsic motivation and a possible intrinsic motivation. So take a look at the next one and pull out your journal, write a little bit about this. Mary notices and complains that mid-grade gasoline has recently risen 40 cents a gallon. Mary chooses to purchase a used Toyota Prius, which goes 54 miles on 1 gallon of gasoline, instead of a used Camry, which goes 27 miles on a gallon. So, what action did Mary take, and what are possible intrinsic and extrinsic motivations? All right, let's look at a possible response. So, this is what I came up with. So, what Mary does, she buys a more efficient car. Intrinsically, Mary may have always been a frugal person. She might have always wanted to save money. So, that's just who she is. She's a person who likes to save money. But extrinsically, let's say Mary has just taken a new job that is further away from home. So she needs a car which gets more miles to the gallon, right? Now, you may have said something very differently for the extrinsic motivation. You probably said something very similar to what I said for intrinsic motivation, but for extrinsic, you might have said something totally different. That's just fine, right? As long as it will have motivated Mary to purchase the car which gets better gas mileage. All right. So, according to Pickering and Hopper, characters can be categorized using three basic criteria: their relation to the action of the story. So, based on how they relate to the action of the story, we can categorize them. We can categorize them based on the degree to which they are developed or whether or not they change significantly throughout the narrative. So let's talk about categorizing characters based on their role in the story first. The major or central character is the most important character in a story. Novels will have several major characters. Short stories usually have one or two. This is the character the plot revolves around. Sometimes this character is called the hero or heroine. Since the actions of this character may not always be heroic, often this character is more neutrally labeled the protagonist. So sometimes we will actually be focusing on in a story the villain, right? So rather than call this person the hero, we will call this person the protagonist. So the protagonist is the character that the story revolves around. Works of fiction can have more than one protagonist. Short stories usually have only one or two, like I said. And the antagonists then are the character or characters or forces opposed to the protagonist. The protagonist and the antagonist are connected by the story's conflict. And we often consider the antagonist a major character of the story as well. Stories also have minor characters. They are not as important as the major characters, but they still play a large part in the story. Their actions help drive the story forward. They may impact the decisions the protagonist or antagonist make, either helping or interfering with the conflict. So let's look at some examples here. So if you think about Jurassic Park, the scientists and kids, they're the protagonists. The dinosaurs are the antagonists. And there's also a few characters who are antagonists. It's been a while since I've seen Jurassic Park, but the guy who's trying to steal the dinosaur DNA, or he would definitely be an antagonist, right? But the main protagonist and antagonist will be the scientists, kids, and the dinosaurs. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, the protagonist, and Darth Vader is the antagonist. In the story Cinderella, Cinderella is the protagonist, the stepmother is the antagonist. And in Psycho, if you've ever watched the movie Psycho, Norman Bates is the protagonist. He's the person that the story focuses on, and Marion Crane, Lila Crane, and Sam Loomis are the antagonists. Now, notice here, the protagonists aren't always the good guys. So, Marion, Lila, and Sam are the good guys, and Norman Bates is actually the murderer, right? So, he's the bad guy, but he's who we focus on. So, we'll call him the protagonist. We can also categorize characters according to degree of development. The novelist E.M. Forster distinguished between flat and round characters in his book Aspects of the Novel. According to Forster, a flat character is constructed round a single idea or quality. These characters are one-dimensional. They tend to exhibit only one or two character traits. They generally play minor roles in fiction since their personalities are not fully developed. They're there to move the story forward, as we talked about before. Characters who are immediately recognizable because they appear so often in several different works are called stock characters. So, stock characters are basically those characters that just with a tiny description, you know exactly how that character will act, you know exactly how that character will think and feel. These are usually based on stereotypes, and examples of a stock character includes the cruel stepmother in fairy tales, right? The gay best friend. There for a while, especially in the late 80s and 90s, in every romantic comedy there was a gay best friend, right? And you know exactly when you see the gay best friend how that person will act, how that person feels, what role that person plays in the story. Just like with the stepmother in fairy tales, you know exactly how the stepmother will act. You know exactly how the stepmother will feel and how she will relate to the story. Another example would be the angry police captain from buddy cop dramas. You have two guys who are, or two women who are on the police force, and their police captain is all, you know, they're always being called into the office. They're always getting in trouble. That angry police captain is another one of those stock characters. I'm sure you could list several examples of each of these. So, according to Roberts and Jacobs, stock characters are representative of their group, and they stay flat as long as they do no more than perform their roles and exhibit conventional and unindividual traits. And I love that description of a stock character. A stock character is a character that has only unindividual traits. So they are traits of a group. Now, you want to watch out for these stock characters because sometimes they might have negative stereotypes. And when you see that, just be aware of it, right? We're going to read stories from many different time periods, from many different places in the world, and there may be negative stereotypes, but all we can do as readers is just notice that, sort of comment on it, think about how that relates to the overall story, and move on. So I keep talking about character traits here, and here this is a painting of E.M. Forster, and he's telling us that character traits are distinguishing qualities, attitudes, behaviors, or characteristics displayed by a character. You probably already knew that, but I just wanted to make that clear. On the other hand, we have round characters, and they are more fully developed. Round characters are sort of like the characters that we meet every day, right? People that you meet are rarely defined by one or two characteristics. They're complete people who are complex, right? So round characters are complex and embody many different character traits. And according to Daniel and Saphir, readers come to appreciate round characters' complexity as if they were actual persons. And major or central characters, the protagonist and oftentimes the antagonist, the major characters of a story tend to be round. So let's look at each of these characters and we will identify each as flat or round and explain why. And I'll look at the first two and then I'll let you look at the last two and then we'll talk about them together. So, Mr. Filch from Harry Potter, what do you think? I think he's a flat character. He can be summed up as the crabby Hogwarts caretaker who likes to catch students breaking the rules. That's all. That's really what his function is in the story. So I think he's a pretty flat character. But what about Brian from Family Guy? Well, I think Brian is a round character because he has many personality traits and cannot be easily summed up. For example, he loves Lois, but is also loyal to Peter, his best friend. He likes escargot and chablis, but still pees on the carpet. So he is a round character. He doesn't fit into a certain character type like Filch does. And I realize that we do learn some things about Filch as the story progresses, but he really doesn't play any other role than the caretaker who always catches students breaking the rules. We do tend to learn a little bit about why he is the way he is, but he doesn't really come out of that uh, characterization of just the crabby old caretaker. All right. So look at the last two characters. So Wolverine from the X-Men films. So I'm thinking about Wolverine from the films especially, and Renfield from Dracula. If you remember Dracula, Renfield is the character that Dracula sort of gets to be his uh, caretaker, right? So I think Renfield is in like an insane asylum at the beginning of the novel, and Dracula sort of busts him out and promises to give him immortality if he will serve the count. So that's Renfield. So think about these, maybe write a little bit about them in your journal, and we'll take a look after you have written and thought about these. Okay, I hope that you've identified Wolverine and Renfield as either round or flat. Let's take a look at what I thought. I thought that Wolverine was a round character. He also has many personality traits, just like Brian, I guess, is what I was thinking, and cannot easily be summed up. For example, he is a macho loner type, right? But he also loves Jean Grey and has paternal feelings for Rogue. He has a vulnerable side due to a past he cannot fully remember. And I forgot the A there. It should say has a vulnerable side due to a past he cannot fully remember. So I think that Wolverine there is a round character for sure. Renfield, on the other hand, I think is a flat character because he really just wants to eat bugs and please his master. That's what he's there for. He does eat bugs throughout the novel. If you've read Dracula, if you've seen any of the films, in fact, there's a film starring Leslie Nielsen called Dracula Dead and Loving It. It's sort of like a spoof, right, or a comedy based on the Dracula story. And there are some pretty hilarious scenes with Renfield eating eating bugs and people reacting to his bug eating. I mean, I'm smiling right now as I talk about it because they are pretty funny scenes. You can find them on YouTube. All right, let's move on. So, categorizing characters based on whether they experience a change. Static characters are characters who do not experience a change through the course of the narrative. These characters are often, though not always, minor characters. They have the same personality, display the same attitude, and or have the same values at the end of the story as they did at the beginning. On the other hand, dynamic characters do experience a change. So if the characters pretty much have the same personality throughout the story, we call those static characters. If they change their personality or their attitude or their values during the course of the story, we call them dynamic characters. And often the change a dynamic character undergoes contributes to some meaning or contributes some meaning to the narrative, excuse me. Let's think about the Disney phenomenon that is Frozen, right? It just won't stop. Olaf is a static character. He is the same fun loving and childlike snowman at the end of the film that he was when Anna and Kristoff first meet him. Elsa, however, is a dynamic character. She is at first afraid of her powers, and she tries to hide her true nature from her sister and the world. But by the end of the story, she has come to terms with her power, is not afraid any longer, and is able to reverse the external winter she cast over the kingdom. Probably the most famous, I think, dynamic character ever is Ebenezer Scrooge, right? So also consider Scrooge. He is probably one of the most famous, that's what I just said, most famous dynamic characters in all of literature. So, what I want us to do now is I want us to identify each as a static or dynamic character, and we'll look at the first three together, and then I'll let you look at the last two. So, Buzz Lightyear from Toy Story. Do you remember the movie Toy Story? I know that we're on Toy Story 4 now, so this has been a long time ago, but if you remember back to that first story, Buzz I think is a dynamic character since he changes from a delusional space hero to a self-accepting toy. So at first he doesn't realize he's a toy, but throughout the story and throughout the movie, he comes to terms with the fact that he is a toy and he accepts that. If any of you have watched The Hunger Games or read the Hunger Games novels, um, President Snow, think about President Snow. Well, I think President Snow is a static character, since he is just as ruthless and evil at the end of the story as he is at the beginning. Now, you have to think about round and flat characters and static and dynamic characters separately. I do think that President Snow is a round character. There are lots of things going on with him, right? But he really doesn't make any sort of significant changes in his attitude or his personality. So you can be round and static. All right, let's look at Tom Sawyer. Again, I think Tom Sawyer, is a static character since he remains in all of the stories about him basically immature, imaginative, and obsessed with stories. He likes adventure. Now, look at the Joker from The Dark Knight, now specifically the Joker from The Dark Knight and Neville Longbottom from the Harry Potter series, and tell me if you think these are static or dynamic characters. Okay, I hope you looked at the Joker and Neville Longbottom. Let's see what I thought here. I thought that the Joker is a static character. He's basically a sociopath throughout The Dark Knight. Doesn't really change. We don't see him change. He just sort of wreaks havoc, right? But on the other hand, I think Neville Longbottom is a dynamic character for sure. He transforms from the geeky, clumsy first year to a wizard to be reckoned with by the end of the Harry Potter series. It's always there. I mean, he's sort of brave and strong from the start, or tries to be, but he really comes into his own in that last book. All right, excellent. So, according to Daniel and Saphir, characterization is the methods used to present the personality of a character in a work of literature. Writers usually reveal character traits to the reader using a combination of 5 main methods. So, there are 5 ways that a writer will reveal character to the reader. Okay. One method that the author uses is commenting directly on a character. So in a story, the narrator, whoever that narrator is, sometimes the narrator is just a voice narrating. You might think of it as the author. Sometimes the narrator is a character in the story. We'll talk more about narrators in the next video. But sometimes the narrator will just comment directly on the character. So when the narrator sings, "You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch," in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, this is direct characterization. The narrator is explicitly giving us insight into the Grinch's character. So that's one way, commenting directly on a character. Another way is sometimes a character's appearance or physical description can reveal something about his or her personality. So Roberts and Jacobs state that appearance and environment reveal much about a character's social and economic status, of course, but they also tell us more about character traits. Sorry, that was the telephone. According to Pickering and Hopper, in real life, appearances are often deceiving. In the world of fiction, however, details of appearance, what a character wears, and how he looks, often provide essential clues to a character. So think of the character Chidi from The Good Place. If you've seen the show The Good Place, it's actually pretty funny. I didn't expect it to be quite as funny and good as it was when I started watching it, but it is pretty funny. So Chidi, for example, in contrast to the other characters, Eleanor, Tahani, sorry, Tahini, I must be hungry. Tahani and Jason, Chidi is kind of a nerd, right? So he's a college professor who is intellectual and philosophical. So naturally, he wears glasses and a lot of sweater vests. So when you look at Chidi and you see glasses, you see the sweater vest, that instantly reads he's someone in maybe academics. He's maybe a professor. He's certainly a nerd, right? What we would call a nerd. So his appearance reveals something about his character. And I'm sure that you can think about some TV shows and books, films that you've watched where something about the character's appearance reveals um, their personality, right? And that's just one example. So, authors can also use names to suggest character traits. For example, Pickering and Hopper state that some characters are given names that suggest their dominant or controlling traits. Other characters are given names that reinforce or sometimes are in contrast to their physical appearance. Names can also contain literary or historical references that aid in characterization by means of association. They warn, however, that one must also be alert to names used ironically, which characterize through inversion. And we'll talk about what irony is, but basically, irony is a contrast between what you expect and what is actually there. So let's consider the name of Peter Pan. So Peter Pan from the play by Barry and from several films is a character, and the name Pan connects this character to the Greek god Pan. Pan was a deity of the wilds, part goat and part human in appearance. He spent his days playing his pipe, frolicking with nymphs, and generally having a jolly time. So that is certainly Peter Pan, right? Those are characteristics Peter Pan has. He likes to just lounge around all day, playing on his instruments and having a good time, right? No responsibility. However, Pan was also known to terrorize those traveling through his wooded home. In fact, the word panic comes from the god Pan's name. So by naming Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie is aligning his character with both sides of the god's nature. Peter is a jolly, frolicking character. However, he is also somewhat sinister. He doesn't want people to grow up, and that is a dangerous notion because everyone has to grow up, right? So, so that's sort of subtle, but Barry is telling us, yes, not growing up, that sounds great, that sounds wonderful, that sounds very fun, but look at the darker um, aspects of not being able to grow up, or the darker aspects of being one of the lost boys, for example. The lost boys are lost, it's in their name, right? So Peter Pan's name suggests his something about his character. Also, statements made by other characters can reveal much about the reader, or much to the reader. Remember Belle? In the opening song of Beauty and the Beast, we learn a great deal about her because of all the villagers who gossip about her as she goes about her day in the village. Roberts and Jacobs contend that by studying what characters say about each other, the reader may enhance his or her understanding of the character being discussed. They remind us that, ironically, speeches often indicate something other than what the speakers intend, perhaps because of prejudice, stupidity, or foolishness. And finally, what characters think, say, and do can also reveal character traits. For example, in Eudora Welty's story, A Worn Path, the character Phoenix Jackson repeatedly walks a great distance into town from her home in rural Mississippi to obtain medicine for her grandson, despite being elderly and needing to use a cane. This shows us how much love she has for her grandson and that she faces her responsibilities no matter how difficult. Pickering and Hopper suggest a character's actions, words, and thoughts are the most important method of revealing his or her personality. Readers should remember to always compare a character's actions and speech to his or her thoughts. If they do not match up, a reader can gain much insight into a character's personality. So, authors usually choose to reveal the personality of their characters through names, appearance, physical description, speech, thought, or action, and what other characters say about them, rather than through direct comment. So, the first one we talked about, direct comment, is used least often because it's not as interesting. Just telling us that the Grinch is a mean one is not as fun as showing us that he's mean by what he does, right? So, if the author doesn't directly comment on the characters that he or she is writing, the reader then has the pleasure of drawing his or her own conclusions about the kinds of people those characters are. So, what I want to do is I want to look in these passages for ways in which the author reveals character. Okay, so let's look at this excerpt together, and then I will let you look at a couple of excerpts. So this is from Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat. A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg. A man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied round his head. A man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, who limped and shivered, and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. So let's think about this. How is the character revealed in this excerpt? Well, first of all, I think the character's words reveal that he is a violent man, right? Keep still, he says, or I'll cut your throat, right? So he will resort to violence. So the character's words, what the character says. The narrator is commenting directly on the character when he calls him a fearful man. The character's physical description, iron on the leg, soaked in water, lamed by stones, cut by flints, reveals that he is an escaped convict, right? And he seized me by the chin, lets me know that the character's actions reinforce the fact that he is a violent person. So there's a lot going on in this relatively small passage. Let's look at a couple other passages. So this is from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. And then this again is from Great Expectations. My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron, fastened over her figure, behind with two loops, and having a square, impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. So think about where these writers, where Charles Dickens reveals character and how he reveals character. Okay, I hope that you identified some places where character is revealed. Let's see what I came up with. So I think that the top one is basically a direct comment by the narrator telling the reader that Scrooge is covetous, tight-fisted, and a sinner, right? So that's just basically direct comment. So when Charles Dickens says, and this is Pip, actually, if you know the story of Great Expectations, Pip is the protagonist here, and his sister is Mrs. Joe. So, by naming Mrs. Joe in terms of her husband rather than giving her a name, the author highlights the fact that her role of wife and homemaker is dominant in her life. The character's physical description, a prevailing redness of skin, always wore a coarse apron, reveals that her life is made up of constant domestic chores. And I left that she in there when I revised this. So reveals that her life, not she, her. Sorry about that. So good. Those are ways that the author reveals character. Let's look at one last excerpt here. It says, Nan waved her hands wildly as she talked to Rob. Mother wants to grow corn in the front yard. Can you imagine what Elaine will say? Who cares? You don't have to listen to Elaine, Rob said. He stood at the window. Oh, don't I? Nan asked. You're wrong about that. You don't have to listen to Elaine because you're at work in the city all day. I do have to listen to Elaine. She's the only person over 10 I get to talk to all day. Except Mother. I wasn't counting her, Nan said. That's cruel. I'm sorry. It's just it's not easy for me. I don't want corn in the front yard. I do care what the neighbors think. You don't, and Mother doesn't either. She doesn't care what anyone thinks. She lives in a world of her own. She pushed the screen door open and ran into the yard. So let's think about this one. How is character revealed? Well, I think the author of this passage uses other characters' words to define a character. We can infer that Elaine is a critical person and maybe a little obnoxious, maybe. I think we can also infer here that Elaine maybe rules the roost or is the one who tries to boss everyone else, right? Because, they're talking about what Elaine will think. And another instance of using other characters' words to define a character is in the last paragraph. Nan says that Rob and Mother do not care what other people think about them. Likewise, Nan reveals something about herself by stating that she does care what the neighbors think. So, as you are reading the short stories for this week, and as you think about the stories that we read previously when we talked about plot, think about the way that characters are developed. Think about whether the characters are major or minor, protagonists or antagonists, round or flat, static or dynamic. And here are the works that I cited and consulted when creating this presentation. I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you later.